Yep. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Don't worry, Dave. We'll be back, right? All right. Let's turn in our Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. So again, that's Hebrews chapter 11. And we're going to be continuing our series of studies on Hebrews chapter 11, the sometimes called Hall of Faith. I've been referring to it as examples of the life of faith. And that's Hebrews 11. If you're using the handout, which you don't have to, it would be Roman numeral 6, the faith of Moses. But again, you don't have to have that. But if you are using it and taking notes, you'll find it there on the backside, the faith of Moses. Now, this evening, what we're going to be looking at is, if you will, part 2 of the examples of life of faith with Moses. And one of the things Moses is going to do is encourage us not to fear man. In other words, what man can do, but rather trust in two particular things. In other words, live by faith, and we'll have two things that we see here. So again, Moses is going to show us, or the example of Moses is going to show us not to fear man, in other words, what man might do to us, but to trust in two things, or live by faith in two particular things that was demonstrated in the life of Moses. Now, if you're taking notes on the particular verses, we'll look at 3 verses. We'll look at verse 27, by faith Moses out of Egypt. So that's verse 27 in Hebrews 11. And then in Hebrews 11, verse 28, we'll see by faith Moses the Passover. So again, what we're looking at here is out of Egypt is being shown as an example of faith by Moses. And then in verse 28, the faith of Moses is seen in the Passover. And then finally, we'll see by faith Moses in the Red Sea, verse 29. And we'll see how that relates to the life of faith. Now, before we actually look at those 3 verses and look at those 3 examples, just if you remember the basic structure of Hebrews 11, the first 10 chapters, if you remember, those are basically the author explaining the superiority of Christ. So I had mentioned he's superior to the angels. He's superior to the priesthood, Aaron and Moses and so forth. His sacrifice is superior because what is unique about Jesus' sacrifice? It was once and for all. So those are some types of things. And so the author says, he's superior. Why would you return back to what you would have had before you came to Christ, in a sense? I mean, why would you go back to something that is inferior when Christ is sufficient and superior to all things? Why would you return back to that? And so what he does with chapter 11 is he essentially gives a list of various individuals from the Old Testament and says, here's an example of, and remember I've used this before, Job lived a life of faith. Here's an example of when he did that. And it's to encourage them to keep going, to keep pursuing and living a life of faith. And I've told you before, part of it, and a way to think of it is, sometimes it's good to have an example of something to encourage us to, or to have as an example of faith in this case. Now, the structure of chapter 11, if you remember, after the verses that we read, like with what Dave mentioned, we see the structure is by faith, X. And we've seen by faith in the pre-patriarchal period, by faith Abel, Enoch, and Noah. So we saw those in verse 4, verse 5, and verse 7. And that's the pre-patriarchal period. Then the author moves to the patriarchal period, and he shows by faith Abraham. He gave us 2 examples of Abraham. Abraham left, if you remember in the first one, the security of Ur for an unknown place. I mean, it wasn't as though God said, here's every little bit and nook and cranny that's going to happen. He didn't know. He had to go by faith. We saw Sarah is included. And then the second example of Abraham was related to his son. Anybody remember? Yep. Right? Isaac. And so what you also see as we get into this patriarchal period is the author includes sort of a thread. He says, look, Abraham was willing to offer up the one through whom the promise of the Abrahamic covenant would come through, which is Isaac. He believed God enough that even if he had died, in other words, sacrificed, that God would raise him from the dead. And then we saw Isaac, Jacob, and then we saw Joseph. Joseph was so certain of his faith. I particularly thought this one was interesting when we looked at it. At his death, at the very end of Exodus, he said, look, I know I'm going to die, but I'm also sure God's going to fulfill his promise, take these people, meaning Israel, bring them into the promised land, and I'm so sure that you're going to bury my bones there. And we saw that, of course, with the transition to Moses. Now, Moses, we saw last week, Moses is a little bit different because Moses is showing us that, or the example is showing us that it's faith under opposition and persecution, or life or opposition, or having faith under difficulties. How many of us have to live by faith in a world that sometimes is difficult? Or do you think living by faith in Christ is easy? So here's some examples, in other words, of why you need to live by faith. Now, the author was writing to a group of individuals that were being persecuted. And I think we sometimes, I say forget this, but we are blessed in the United States and have been because we really don't have much persecution, do we? I mean, and by and large, we haven't. We've been blessed by that. But the preponderance of church history is just really the opposite. And so this gives us examples, Moses' example. Now, before we look at tonight's, if you want to remember Moses' example, we saw part 1 was verse 23 through verse 26. Now, by faith, Moses, and it gives the example of whom related to Moses. Do you remember from last week, verse 23? It was his parents. So the first part of the example of Moses starts with his parents. His parents were given as an example. There was the edict, if you remember, to kill all of the children, the male children. And he was, of course, one of them, and his parents protected him. They weren't afraid of what Pharaoh would do. They trusted in the Lord. But then when when Moses got older, in verses 24 through 26, do you remember some of the things that happened with him? What did Moses give up? Anybody remember?
His royalty.
Yeah, right, Dave. So, for instance, in verse 24, it says, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up. So again, these aren't biographies in the sense. They're sort of, here's an example of someone's faith. He, of course, he refused that particular position. He renounced his position, and he replaced it with being suffering. Now, how many of us would do that? He had all that Egypt had to offer, and he lays that aside and is willing to suffer with his people. He was future-oriented, and this is one of the things that fascinates me in chapter 11 that we've seen, is there's still this sort of future-oriented person where they see God has made a promise of something in the future, and they act on it in the present. So it's sort of the idea of faith in the unseen, or what God hasn't fulfilled yet. But having said all that, let's pick up and let's look at part 2 of Moses, verse 27, out of Egypt. Would someone want to read that one for me, verse 27?
By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen.
All right, thank you, Dave. So here we see that it moves forward to a basic example that it's looking at Moses as a life of faith and taking faith and living by faith by leaving Egypt, and he wasn't afraid of the king, the Pharaoh, if you will. Now, there are two views on which particular period of time this is referring to, and I'll give you both of them, and then we'll turn to Exodus. The first one is what's called the Midian view. In other words, we'll see it in a second. When Moses saw one of his brethren struck down, he fled. Okay, we'll look at a little more detail in a second. Or two, the author is referring to when they actually left Egypt for the last time. I think the second one's probably the better of the two, but I'll give you both. They both give the same principle. But let's turn to Exodus real quick, and I'll give you the references. But let's turn to Exodus 2, and you'll probably remember this one. This is about the part we left off in last time, but in Exodus 2, Moses as an adult, he saw one of his brethren being killed. And then at the end of verse 14, so this is Exodus chapter 2, verse 14, it says, "Then Moses was afraid and said, 'Surely the matter has become known.'" Now, what does Moses do when he finds out that one of his brethren had been killed? Does anyone remember? Moses, of course, struck down somebody, didn't he? Okay. So one view is, and it would be, if you have a study Bible, it's called the Midian view. In other words, this is what the author's referring to when he fled because he was afraid of what would happen there. I don't actually think that's the best timing of it, because if you remember in the example in Hebrews, it says that he wasn't afraid, whereas here it says he was afraid. So the principle is going to be the same, but I'm just giving you both of the timings. The second timing, I think this one fits a little bit better, is the view that the author is referring to when they left Egypt, meaning with finality. They left for the last time. If you turn over to Exodus chapter 10, and I'll show you this one. Now, this has to do with the chart that I gave you. You don't necessarily need the chart, but when I was working on it and getting it prepared, I came across, this is from the Ryrie Study Bible. It has a really good chart, and I made copies because, to be honest with you, it's really easy. You can see how many plagues there are. How many plagues were there? Yeah. All right, so I gave you an easy one, right? So you get an extra 10 points on your quiz tonight. But if you wanted a handy and you want to review it, but it has the verses, and that's a helpful chart for all the plagues. But this is the one that I think the author is alluding to, because I think there's a few reasons for it. First, if you go back to, and you don't need to, but if you go back to the Hebrew passage, and it's in verse 27 that Dave read, the Greek word for left or forsook means to do so permanently versus temporarily. So you might leave something on a temporary basis. So I left the house to go get what? I don't know, milk, right? And so I had to stop by the bank and get a $100 bill to pay for the milk. But anyway, I left, but it's with the idea of coming back. The other way to render it is I left, I forsook something, and I have no plans to come back, and that's what the Greek word is. So I tend to think that the idea here is when they left Egypt for good. But in any case, if you look at the plagues chart, you know what happens is Pharaoh, of course, will he or will he not let the people go? He won't. It just over and over he won't. And so God keeps bringing all these various plagues upon them. When you get to the last plague, of course, you will see that the second time is, again, the one that I think he's referring to. And let's look at Exodus 10, verse 28 for the reference here. Then Pharaoh said to him, "Get away from me, beware, do not see my face again, for the day you see my face you shall die." And Moses said, "You are right, I shall never see your face again." And so the second view, I think, is probably better to see it as the author of Hebrews is looking back, saying that when Moses decided with finality to leave Egypt, in other words, to get his people delivered out of Egypt, he forsook, in other words, he left permanently, and he wasn't afraid of what Pharaoh would do to him. And so basically what I want us to see is that either when he fled at Midian, when he was 40, or when he left at the time of the Exodus, the idea here was that he wasn't fearful of man. He knew that the Lord would be faithful. God would do what he said. So he wasn't afraid of man. He was faithful to the Lord. I'm going to read for you a proverb. Proverbs, you don't have to turn here because we're going to go back in just a second. But Proverbs 29 and verse 25 gives us a good way to sort of apply this a little bit better, I think. Proverbs 29, verse 25, it says, "The fear of man brings a snare, but he who trusts in the Lord will be exalted. So again, the idea there is you and I don't need to be fearful of man. We need to trust in the Lord and let the Lord take care of things. And in many ways, that's what we'll see with Moses. Moses, of course, wasn't fearful of what the Pharaoh would do, but he trusted himself in the living God. Before we move on to the second example with the Passover, I'm going to read for you. I mentioned David Levy. I think he's come to this church before. I think it's been a while. For Friends of Israel, he has a commentary on Hebrews, and he says, "When Moses' eyes fixed on the invisible God who enabled him to stand boldly against the exceedingly great power of Pharaoh, who was determined to destroy him." And so what he was saying there is that God was the one through whom he fixed his eyes on. Moses had his eyes fixed on the Lord. He knew that what God would do, he would bring forward what he had promised. He trusted in the Lord, and so he fixed his eyes on the Lord. And the interesting thing about what Levy says there is that's the very thing that the Lord is, or the author of Hebrews is going to say at the end of chapter 11. He says we need to fix our eyes on Jesus Christ, the author and perfecter of our faith. And so the idea with that one is we fix our eyes on the Lord and not worry about what man can do to us. We trust in what God can do, which is God can deliver, and of course he does. Now the question is, how does God deliver? What's the last plague? Anyone know on that cheat sheet that I have there for you? What's the last plague? All right. Now, what happened as a result of that? In other words, for many, many years after that, one of the feasts of the Jews is what? Okay, so let's go look at Hebrews 11 and verse 28. I want someone to read that. So you see the progression. The author says that Moses lived a life of faith. He trusted in the Lord more than he feared man. He brought the people out of Egypt, and one of the results of that was, of course, what we see in verse 28, which is the reference to Passover. So, did you want to read it, Merritt?
Mm-hmm. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them.
All right. So what I want us to see here is that the author is going to move from faith to faith. He's going to believe in God's commandment, believe in God's word, but also believe in the provision that he's going to give. God's going to give provision based on obedience to something he asked them to do. So Passover is one of the Jewish feasts. God had promised to deliver Israel an example of this. We don't have to turn here. If you want to reference Exodus 6:6, God had promised he would deliver Israel out of the bondage of Egypt. The first Passover is what you have on that chart there, the 10th plague. And basically, as we talked about, it's the death of the firstborn. But there was a condition that you would receive provision from the Lord if you did something. What was the act of obedience that you had to take in order for God to pass over you? Does anyone know? What did they have to do? Right. So the act of obedience was you need to slay the lamb, you have to take the blood, and you have to put it over the door, and then you have to trust what I have told you, and what I've told you, meaning the Lord, is that I will pass over your house and I will not bring judgment on that firstborn. So that's the idea of Passover. So the condition is that if they applied the blood to the door, God would, of course, do what? He would deliver them. He would overlook and go to the first, or he would skip the firstborn and would not kill them. If you want to read the entire story, I've been trying to give you these. It's Exodus 11:1 through 12:36, but let's just read a few of these verses for time's sake. And so what he's showing here, as the author is that they had to, meaning Moses in particular is what he's focusing on, they had to trust what God had said in order to receive his provision. And of course, that's going to apply to us today, so we'll see in a minute. But let me just read a few of these verses. This is Exodus 12, verse 7. The Lord, of course, is giving instruction on how provision would come. For example, in Exodus chapter 12, verse 7, it says, "Moreover, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat." Now, the next one, let's read in verse 29 through 32. "Now it came about at midnight, the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive, who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. Pharaoh arose in the night, and he and all of his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home where there was not someone dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron at night and said, 'Rise up, get out from among my people, both you and the sons of Israel, and go worship the Lord as you have said,'" and so forth. And so what we see is what happened. Well, the plague came, didn't it? Just as God described it would be. But what happened to those who trusted, in other words, were obedient to God's commandment? They received his provision, didn't they? There was nothing else they could do. They couldn't add to the blood, could they? All they were called to do was to trust what God had provided. In other words, he would provide provision if you put the blood, as Terry was saying, on the doorpost, and God would pass over that. And God did that very thing. But I want us to think about something. Can you imagine the type of faith that you'd have to have for that? Now, we've talked about the flood before. Something about the flood, and Dave was mentioning this when we studied this. At that time, in other words, when the flood had come, not only was the water completely unique, the world had never seen any sort of judgment like the flood, had they? I mean, you couldn't comprehend it. In other words, you heard it, you understood it, but it's hard to imagine, isn't it, what it's like? I think of it as, if you know in the book of Revelation, how many of you have ever had some trouble not understanding so much, but fathoming those judgments? They're hard to fathom, aren't they? In a way, of course, we know that Noah had to believe that God could do that he could bring judgment, but he also had to believe God, that God would provide a way out of it. And the way out of it was what? To be mocked and made fun of because he made that ark. I kind of thought the same thing here, because in a sense, there's no past examples of God doing this. There's no past examples that he could look to. He had to believe, Moses, he had to believe that God would make good on his word. And, of course, trust that God would do that, and he had to trust that God would provide provision. Now, how does God provide provision for you and I today for eternal life?
The Holy Spirit to teach.
Right? So what is God's sacrifice that he gave? The Lamb. Yeah. Christ.
Himself.
Right, exactly. So Jesus, of course, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, that's God's provision today, and we can't add to it, can we? All we can do is base off of what God's commanded us to do, which is to do what? By faith alone in Christ alone, we trust in what God has provided for us. And what happens? We, of course, don't receive judgment, do we? We're not appointed to wrath. We simply trust in what God's provision is there. And that's one of the things that Moses did there, was he trusted that, hey, if I instruct these people to obey what God says, God will, of course, skip over. In other words, he wouldn't bring that judgment. That's a lot of faith, isn't it? How many of us would want to act and to do something to protect the family or the son? I probably would be honest with you. My first thought would be, okay, let's put some blood on the door, and is there a way to barricade the door? Is there a way to do something, all right?
Probably was a lot of barricades.
Yeah, exactly. And I think of it that way without, don't want to overemphasize the illustration, but you and I can no more add a barricade to our salvation. We just have to trust in what God's provided. And that's really an act of faith, isn't it? It's faith in what God's provision is, even though we know it's good. But let's move on. So we've seen the example of believing God, that God would deliver them out of Egypt. They didn't need to fear what Pharaoh would do. Moses, of course, believed God would provide that, and God would be faithful to his word. In Passover, we see there the example there of provision. God gives provision and he had to be obedient to the command. And then let's look at the third and last one here in verse 29. Someone want to read that final one, or else I'll read it?
I can do it, Stephen.
Okay.
By faith they passed through the Red Sea, as though they were passing through dry land, and the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned.
Okay. Now you'll notice this one has a little bit of a nuance. By faith, whom? Notice how it says they? It's kind of interesting, isn't it? So what you see is by faith Moses. We've had these various examples of Moses. Moses brings the people out. The people, of course, are following Moses' lead. And then eventually, of course, they have to, in order to completely get away, they have to go and they have to believe in God's protection of them. So whereas the previous one is his provision, here they have to believe that God will protect them. Now, this is in Exodus 14, and we won't read all of it, obviously. So if you notice what the author does, he says first, God, of course, instructed Moses on the way to get the people out. Don't fear what Pharaoh's going to do. I'll deliver you. I'll get you out of Egypt. Just follow what I'm telling you to do. One of those examples was, his provision. His provision was, of course, the blood and so forth, what we think of as Passover. But this third one, he's going to have to, of course, the people here are included. You notice that they're going to have to believe in God's protection. So in Exodus 14, we come to an interesting passage here. Because Pharaoh, did he want them back, or was he okay with them going, the Israelites? He wanted them back, didn't they? So think of the setting this way. The people leave, they have the provision of the Passover, and now they're going along their way, and then all of a sudden they run into the sea's in front of them. What's behind them? Okay, right? So they're kind of stuck, aren't they? What do? Because looking forward, there's an obstacle. Looking backward, there's an obstacle. But yet God says, I'll deliver you. Now, what happens with the people? Now, as a pastor, I love throwing this in for fun. But do you know what happened when they found out they were sort of sandwiched? Well, they panicked, yes, but they also complained.
They did a lot of that.
Yes, they did. So they had a lot of complaining. I'm going to read this to you because as a pastor I enjoy picking at the church members this way. But you notice what happens. It says, then they said to Moses, they said, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? You notice how it's you. Up until then they were fine with God being the one who's delivering them. But when things get scary or whatever, it's your fault. Now notice the rest. Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Of course, who was it ultimately who had brought them out? God. Who was it had brought them there? God. Meaning he had instructed them. Who did they blame? Well, they didn't blame God. They blamed Moses, didn't they? And then you see in verse 12 it says, is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Now, the faith didn't hold very well, did they? It kind of ebbed and flowed. When the manna came, they wanted to go back and get the Egyptian cuisine. It's just a pattern of people, right? So, picking at you. But I want someone to read in all seriousness. Imagine the scene, and then what happens. Someone read verses 13 through 14, and we'll see where God either delivers them as he said or not. Does someone want to read? That's Exodus 14, 13 through 14, or I can read it.
Moses said to the people, don't be afraid. Stand firm and see the Lord's salvation that he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you and you must be quiet.
So did the Lord deliver them? Yes. Did he promise to? He was faithful in all three of those examples, wasn't he? Meaning God was, and so was Moses. And so we have to trust God to protect us. Even what he asks us to do seems absolutely extraordinary, doesn't it? It was extraordinary to, of course, leave Egypt with the Pharaoh's ability to destroy them, but he wasn't afraid. Two, it was also, mean, it would have been quite an extraordinary thing to think, gosh, this death, this angel of death is coming, and you need to believe that just the blood, in other words, of the Lamb would provide provision. And then it's also extraordinary faith to see there's this great sea in front of you, this great army behind you, but walk forward, and they did, and God delivered them, didn't he? And so I think that that's one of the great things about these examples is what I told you before. Moses' examples, I told you at the beginning, encourage us not to fear man, but to trust God in his provision for us, because he will provide provision. We have to believe him and take him at his word, at what he gives us. But we also have to remember that God will protect us too, won't he? When God says he will protect us, does he not protect his people? Even when it seems impossible. The sea in front of you, the army behind you. I thought I'd give us this one. We'll see if you guys have any comments or questions. I want to give one for Dave for his spreadsheet. It's Psalm 125, verse 1. Those who trust in the Lord are as Mount Zion, which cannot be moved, but remains forever. That's a good one. Those who trust in the Lord are as Mount Zion, which cannot be moved, but remains or abides forever. That's Psalm 125 in verse 1. Now next week we'll look at Jericho and Rahab. I don't know what's Rahab doing in there. I thought she was a harlot. Anybody have any questions or comments?